Where is the geezer? I think he should be held accountable for it. He should be held accountable for it.
It's a valid point. A lot of people do feel that all politicians...
The studio lights burned bright as Danny Dyer leaned forward, voice sharp and raw, calling out the political elite in a way no one dared. Across from him, Keir Starmer froze. The man known for calm control suddenly looked cornered, his smile slipping as Dyer's words hit harder than any political debate ever could. The room went silent. The audience could feel something real unfolding. Not rehearsed, not staged, just raw truth colliding with power. By the end, Starmer wasn't just flustered. He was exposed. And the question everyone's asking is, how did one blunt working-class actor manage to do what Parliament never could? The secret, that hit home. When Danny Dyer started speaking, you could practically feel the temperature in the studio change. He wasn't reading from notes or following a political script. He was just saying what millions of ordinary people have been thinking for years. His voice had that familiar mix of rage and honesty that you can't fake, the kind that makes politicians squirm in their seats. And Keir Starmer. He looked like he'd been hit with a pint of truth straight to the face. What Dyer said wasn't just criticism, it was a revelation. His secret was something so obvious, so painfully real that it hurt to hear out loud. The idea that Britain is still being run by the same elite circle of people who all went to the same posh schools, drank in the same clubs, and have absolutely no clue what real life looks like anymore. Dyer didn't sugarcoat it. He went for the jugular. He called out the small group that's been in charge for generations, the Eton-educated crowd who treat government like a family business. He said what many of us have yelled at the TV for years, that people who've never worried about rent, never stood in line at the job centre, or never had to choose between heating and food, have no business pretending they understand the working class. It wasn't a political speech. It was a working man's battle cry. The people who went to Eton can't run this country, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. They've tried, they've failed, and it doesn't work. It was raw, furious, and impossible to argue with. But what made the moment so explosive wasn't just what Dyer said, it was who he said it to. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader who's supposed to represent those same working people, was sitting right there. Dyer turned to him and with a smirk that could melt steel, basically asked the question that no one in Westminster ever wants to hear. You talk of representing working class life, but do you know it? You could have heard a pin drop. Starmer froze, the kind of silence that doesn't come from not knowing the answer, but from realising the answer might be no. Dyer's point wasn't subtle. He accused Starmer of being just another suit in a long line of suits, the kind of politician who claims to understand the everyday struggles of normal people, but spends most of his time surrounded by advisors, PR handlers, and London elites. Dyer didn't care about Starmer's fancy titles or calm tone. To him, it was all just noise. He said what the working class has felt for decades, that the people running Britain live in a bubble so far removed from reality they couldn't find the cost of milk if you tattooed it on their manifesto. And the best part, he didn't say it politely. He said it with that delicious, unapologetic Cockney bite that made even the camera crew stifle a laugh. Starmer's reaction told the whole story. He tried to smile it off, tried to nod like he agreed, but his face said everything. Dyer wasn't just challenging his politics. He was ripping open the fragile illusion that Labour still belonged to the people who built it. The truth was staring Starmer in the face, and for once, the courtroom-trained debater had no rebuttal. Because how do you defend yourself against reality? Dyer didn't need facts or figures. He had authenticity, and that alone hit harder than any policy paper. The moment went viral because it felt like something rare, real emotion in a political conversation. No rehearsed lines, no empty promises, just one man telling another, "You've lost touch." It stung because it was true. Dyer's words weren't just an attack on Starmer. They were a warning to every politician pretending to be for the people while living a life miles away from them. It was messy, it was blunt, and it was absolutely unforgettable. For the first time in a long time, someone on live TV said what the whole country has been thinking. Maybe it's time Britain was run by people who actually know what it feels like to live here. The clash. That shook the room. The tension was so thick you could almost taste it. Danny Dyer didn't come to play nice. He came to throw verbal punches, and Keir Starmer just happened to be standing in the ring. What started as a harmless chat turned into a full-blown spectacle, the kind of live TV chaos that producers secretly pray for, but politicians dread. Dyer, the self-proclaimed man of the people, leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising with that unmistakable East End fire. Across from him sat Starmer, calm and loyally as ever, trying to keep that polished smile from slipping. But the moment Dyer started tearing into the political class, that calm began to crack. "You're all the same," Dyer barked, gesturing towards Starmer. "You talk about understanding working people, but you don't live it. You've never had to graft a day in your life, mate. You've never worried about paying the bills." The audience gasped and then cheered. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was no filter, no hesitation, just pure, uncut frustration from a man who's spent his life surrounded by the kind of people Starmer claims to represent. The camera caught it perfectly. Dyer's fiery glare meeting Starmer's blank, blinking stare. You could almost hear the Labour leader's PR team screaming into their earpieces backstage. Starmer tried to fight back, but it was like watching a schoolteacher argue with a hurricane. He started with, "I completely understand your frustration, Danny, but..." And that's when Dyer cut him off mid-sentence. "No, you don't. That's the problem. You don't understand. You say all the right things, but where's the passion? Where's the fight? You sound like you're reading off a bloody instruction manual." The crowd erupted. It was electric, like someone had finally said what everyone in Britain had been thinking but never dared to say out loud. What made it even more powerful was how unplanned it all was. Dyer wasn't quoting headlines or spitting statistics. He was speaking from his gut, raw and real, every word landing like a punch. Starmer, on the other hand, fell back into his usual safe mode. Long-winded explanations, careful phrasing, a tone so cautious it bordered on robotic. But that only made things worse. Because next to Dyer's emotion, Starmer's restraint looked cold, detached, almost cowardly. And that was the moment the tide turned. You could feel the audience's sympathy shift completely toward Dyer. For Starmer, it wasn't just a bad interview, it was a turning point. Dyer had done what no Tory, no journalist, no rival within Labour could do. He made the public feel how disconnected their so-called leaders had become. He turned political debate into human emotion, something Britain hadn't seen in years. Starmer may have thought he could brush it off as just another heated conversation, but the nation saw it differently. They saw the working man standing up to the establishment and winning. And as the credits rolled that night, one thing was certain. Danny Dyer didn't just expose a secret. He exposed a system. And Keir Starmer happened to be the unlucky face of it. When the pub spoke louder than Parliament. By the next morning, the entire country was buzzing. What started as a fiery on-air clash between Danny Dyer and Keir Starmer had exploded into a full-blown media storm. Every headline screamed the same thing. Starmer loses it after Dyer's brutal truth bomb. The clip was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, even the morning news. You couldn't escape it. People replayed the moment Dyer called out Britain's elite political class like it was the nation's favourite soap episode, because, in a way, it was. This was EastEnders meets Westminster, and Dyer had just walked off with the award for Best Scene Stealer. What made the fallout so wild wasn't just the argument itself, it was how the public reacted to it. Dyer's outburst didn't come across as celebrity theatrics. It felt real. Ordinary Brits saw themselves in his frustration. Social media turned into a digital pub, with thousands of people cheering, "Danny said what we're all thinking." One tweet summed it up perfectly. "You can keep your policy briefings. I'll take one honest rant from Danny Dyer any day." That one went viral within hours. Even political commentators, the same ones who usually look down their noses at Dyer's rough edges, had to admit that he'd struck a chord the Labour leader hadn't managed in years. Meanwhile, inside Labour HQ, it was full-blown chaos. Aides were panicking, scrambling to control the narrative. They tried spinning the confrontation as a passionate debate that showed Labour's connection to ordinary voices. But no one was buying it, because the truth was, Starmer looked rattled. Really rattled. His usually calm, measured tone was gone, replaced by that awkward, tight-lipped discomfort of someone caught off guard by reality. political analysts started saying out loud what many had quietly believed for a while, that Starmer's biggest weakness isn't his intelligence, it's his inability to connect. And Dyer? He was loving it. The man who once called David Cameron a twat on live TV was now trending again, this time as the people's unofficial opposition leader. Talk shows invited him on. Tabloids crowned him the voice of the working class. Even those who'd rolled their eyes at his bluntness couldn't deny he'd hit a nerve. One columnist wrote, "Danny Dyer did in 3 minutes what Labour's comms team hasn't managed in 3 years, make people care." It was harsh, but true. For Starmer, the humiliation was worse because it wasn't coming from a rival politician. It was coming from a regular bloke with no script, no strategy, and no filter. That's what made it sting. Dyer had spoken with the kind of raw honesty that polished politicians spend careers avoiding. He wasn't quoting think tanks or hiding behind slogans. He was saying, "You've forgotten us." And for once, people believed him. In pubs, in offices, on buses, everyone was talking about it. And the scary thing for Starmer? No one was talking about his response. The moment had taken on a life of its own. Dyer had unknowingly pulled off something that Westminster strategists couldn't manufacture with all their focus groups combined: authenticity. And in doing so, he'd ripped open a national frustration that had been brewing for years. Politicians looked out of touch, voters felt invisible, and along came Danny Dyer, pint in hand, to say what no one else dared. Starmer may have lost his cool on live TV, but what he really lost was something far bigger: the illusion that he could control the narrative. Because once the pub starts talking, Westminster doesn't stand a chance. The moment that changed everything. What happened after that night wasn't just political noise. It was a cultural reset. You could almost feel the shift in the air. Keir Starmer, the man who had spent years crafting his image as calm, collected and untouchable, suddenly looked human in the worst possible way: defensive, flustered and out of his depth. Danny Dyer had done something no journalist, rival or parliamentary grilling had managed. He made Starmer lose his cool. The clip became instant legend. It wasn't just Starmer versus Dyer. It was the moment the establishment collided with the street and the street won. For years, people had whispered that Starmer was too polished, too careful, a man who never truly connected with the working-class roots Labour once stood for. Dyer turned that whisper into a roar. His words, raw and unfiltered, echoed through living rooms, pubs and radio shows across the UK. He didn't just question Starmer's leadership, he questioned his authenticity. "You talk about the working class," Dyer had said, "but you don't live like one, do ya?" It was brutal, yes, but it was also honest, the kind of truth that burns because it's impossible to deny. By the next morning, even political insiders admitted something had changed. Starmer's team reportedly held an emergency meeting, desperate to figure out how to contain the narrative. But you can't contain a cultural moment. And this one had already spiralled far beyond Westminster. On social media, people started calling it the Dyer effect. Memes flooded in. One showed Dyer standing over Starmer with the caption, "When real life meets politics." Another joked, "Danny Dyer just did more for Labour in 5 minutes than Starmer did in 5 years. By accident." It was chaos, and yet the truth was buried in the humour. Dyer had spoken to something raw, the sense that Britain's political class has forgotten who it's supposed to serve. He wasn't quoting statistics or repeating slogans. He was speaking from a place of lived experience. That's why it landed so hard. You didn't have to agree with every word he said to feel that surge of recognition, because everyone at some point has looked at a politician and thought, "You don't get it." Dyer just had the guts to say it out loud, and on national television, no less. As for Starmer, the fallout was bruising. His approval ratings dipped slightly, but the real damage wasn't in the numbers. It was in perception. For a leader who built his brand on composure, that crack in his armour was everything. Suddenly, steady and serious looked like stiff and disconnected. Even supporters were forced to admit he needed to show more fire, more personality, more life. Because in that clash, Dyer didn't just expose Starmer's secret, he exposed the painful truth about modern politics. People are tired of polished perfection. They want passion. They want truth. They want someone who actually feels what they're saying. That's why, even months later, people were still talking about it. It wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. It was a reckoning. Dyer, without realising it, had thrown a mirror in front of the nation's leaders, and what they saw wasn't pretty. The era of rehearsed talking points and safe answers suddenly felt over. And for Starmer, the message couldn't have been clearer. If you want to lead Britain, you can't just sound like you care. You have to prove you remember what it's like to live like the rest of us. The legacy of the meltdown. Weeks after that fiery exchange, the dust still hadn't settled. The moment had gone beyond politics. It had entered pop culture. Talk shows, podcasts, and late-night comedians all had their take on the Dyer versus Starmer showdown. It was the clip that wouldn't die, the kind that rewrites reputations overnight. And for Keir Starmer, that was the real nightmare. Every attempt to move past it only seemed to make it worse. Because once people have seen you flinch, once they've watched your mask slip, it's hard to convince them you're still in control. Danny Dyer, meanwhile, was riding a wave of national attention he hadn't seen in years. He became a sort of accidental folk hero, the unfiltered voice who said what everyone else was thinking. Journalists tried to frame him as reckless, but it didn't stick, because for once, Britain wasn't mocking him. They were cheering him on. He said what needed to be said, one caller told a radio host, and Starmer couldn't handle it. That was the tone everywhere. Admiration mixed with disbelief. It was as if Dyer had broken through a political force field that had kept the public and their leaders apart. Behind the scenes, Labour insiders were in panic mode. Reports leaked that Starmer's team was scrambling to rebrand his public image, with one advisor allegedly saying, "We need him to sound like a person again." That single line said it all. The leader of the Labour Party, a man who was supposed to represent the working class, needed help sounding human. Some MPs tried to defend him, saying Dyer's attack was unfair, that it was tabloid theatre. But even they knew the truth. It resonated because it felt true. Dyer had pulled back the curtain, and everyone could see how disconnected modern politics had become. And that was the legacy of it all. Not just Starmer's discomfort, but the deeper conversation it sparked. Across Britain, people began asking the same question. When did politics stop feeling real? For too long, the system had rewarded those who spoke carefully instead of passionately, who calculated instead of cared. Starmer represented that new breed of politician. Smart, competent, but emotionally flat. Dyer exposed that flaw in one unscripted moment of honesty. It was like watching the power balance flip. A man from the streets outshining a man from Parliament. Even months later, the moment refused to fade. News outlets replayed it every time Starmer gave a speech that sounded too cautious, too rehearsed. Memes still resurfaced whenever he stumbled in interviews. And Danny Dyer. He'd become the accidental conscience of the working class. A loud, lovable reminder that leadership without authenticity isn't leadership at all. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.